Good evening, and welcome to The Right Side. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and this is the show where we talk about issues that are happening in the news and in the community from an admittedly conservative perspective. This evening, in honor of Black History Month, we're going to be discussing conservatism in the Black community, and I'm joined this evening by Rachelle Conner and Marilyn Singloton. Ladies, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Glad we could have you. So we're going to start off a little bit getting to know each other and wanting to know what our audience would probably like to know first is, when did you discover you were conservative and what does that mean to you? We'll actually go ahead and start with Rochelle. What is conservatism to you and how did you find out you were afflicted?
Conservatism to me means being aware of the principles of righteousness, of the principles that guide my life. I grew up in a Christian environment, so principles of conservatism, pro-life, pro-traditional marriage, and fiscal responsibility, those were always principles that were taught in my home.
Okay. And so when did you start to actually identify that that was either in alignment with the rest of the community or slightly misaligned with the community?
I grew up in a military environment. My father was military, so we moved, and we had a lot of exposure to the conservative and the liberal viewpoint. And I realized that the conservative values were more closely aligned with my personal beliefs. And that's what sent me into the direction of activism in the conservative movement.
Okay, great. And so how about you, Marilyn? What does conservatism mean to you, and when did you find out you had been bitten by such a bug?
It came to me genetically. My family has always been conservative. The mantra that my mother told us always growing up in Southeast San Diego and in a segregated neighborhood was, you never have to take low to anybody.
Okay.
You're always as good as the next person, if not better. And there was never an ounce of victimhood, blaming anybody for whatever problems you may have. They're your own. You take personal responsibility for it, and that's your role in society. And our family has always been in service, and we kind of look at ourselves as social workers of one sort or another. And as far as getting politically active, we've just always been involved.
Okay. And so you actually grew up in a segregated environment, even here in very liberal California.
Absolutely.
And so tell me about that. I mean, people would argue that we're still in a segregated society to some degrees. We have the haves and the have-nots. The term that's coming up more recently is the 1% versus the 99%. And we all have been tended to put into buckets. The Asian community feels this way, the Black community feels this way, and this particular group has this set of attributes, and so therefore they always vote Democrat or they always vote Republican, and we can easily politically sort them out into their subgroups. But you actually lived in a segregated environment.
Yes.
But you didn't come out with a liberal kind of victim mentality, as you've already started to outline. Tell me about that, and if there was any evolution or ever a time when you felt like maybe I should have gotten more, or...
No, because where do you get it from? You get it from yourself. So there isn't someone in a tree dropping off goodies to each person. And we never believed that the federal government was the place that gave you anything. You gave it to yourself. If you wanted A's in school, you studied hard. There is no A fairy out there who's going to grant you the A's. And my parents were strict. They were so strict that when I went to Camp Maria Stella, I went to Catholic school and even went to Catholic camp in the summer. I hated lima beans. And the first year I got a demerit for each time I didn't eat the lima beans. And so the second year I said, Mother, could you write on the application that I was allergic to lima beans? She said, you must have lost your mind. No, I will not lie on that application. Right. So, and that's just the way you run your life. And as Rochelle said, you run it with values, and the only person you look to is yourself.
Right. Well, but you've also both either indirectly or directly mentioned faith, and that being a component of one of the reasons that you're conservative. You grew up in a Catholic school environment. You came from a religiously based home as well. Tell me a little bit about, are your views consistent with those that you come in contact within the black community? We'll start there, but we know that we're all one community generally. But for the purposes of the discussion, is this pretty consistent that there's heavy faith and heavy desire to follow traditional family values, traditional marriage, pro-life? Talk to me about that, Rachelle, in your experience.
Historically, the focus point in the black community has been the church. From days of slavery to the present time, the black community has always been a focal point in the church, the pastors, the leaders, the ministers. And I find today that the message is conservative. The message is pro-life. It's traditional marriage. But I think there's a disconnect that occurs when it comes to participation in the civic arena. I think there has been a turning inward of the black church after the 60s, after Martin Luther King, and they, from my perspective, have abandoned the political arena. And so that's why I got involved in politics, is so that I can begin to educate the faith community about its responsibility and stewardship over their vote, and to make that connection between God and government so that they understand historically we have a position of being politically aware, of being politically informed, and also of being politically engaged, and that there is no separation there because of the Judeo-Christian heritage of our country.
Right. And so would you agree that it's that you're seeing similar trends within the community as well, as far as the traditional values?
Honestly, I get a little bothered even when someone discusses the black community, because I really don't feel like there is a black community. There are black Americans who are living in various parts of various towns all across the country, and never really felt that way. And perhaps why it even offends me all the more is the fact that I grew up in a segregated neighborhood where somebody's telling me I have to live in this area. So certainly growing up, my number one thing was, some people don't believe it, people who were much younger than I, that in 1964 there was not fair housing in California. And it wasn't until Proposition 14 where the Californians had voted to have unfair housing, and then that was overturned a couple years later in the Supreme Court, that you cannot have a law that grants unfair housing. So as soon as fair housing was available, it was like, hey, let's get out there and mix with everybody else. We don't have to be living up the street from the Ebony Inn Motel, even though my parents are college educated. Why do we have to live 2 blocks from the Ebony Inn Motel?
Right. And see, that's one of the things that's always made me crazy. When you talk to political activists or political groups, they do tend to lump us into those communities. And it makes me insane, because I don't think of people based first on color. I think, okay, well, what are they good at? What do they like to do, et cetera? And so it's good to hear you also say that it frustrates you, because it makes me absolutely insane. You've both talked about political activism in your parts of the interview. Tell me a little bit about how you originally got engaged, and kind of where your philosophy has evolved since becoming politically engaged, and what that means to you.
Well, currently I serve on the Alameda County Republican Party Central Committee. I'm the parliamentarian. But it started many years ago when a gentleman told me that the Republicans start their meeting with a prayer and the Democrats with a curse, which was very interesting to me. So I went to the meeting to find out whether that was true or not. And indeed, the Republicans began with an invocation. And as they began to outline their platform, I saw that my faith belief lined up very well with the platform at that time. So I decided, for my first involvement in politics, I was going to get involved with the Republican Party. I went through the ranks from precinct secretary up to state party secretary. I served also as the president of the Matsu Republican Women's Club. So I've been very involved and very engaged in party politics. And I think that's the difference between conservatism and republicanism. People that are actually involved in party politics, I would say, are your Republicans, whereas people who are not Republicans can have conservative values. And that, again, comes back to the faith community and the faith beliefs.
Okay. Interesting. I had not heard the correlation between starting with prayers and starting with curses. What's the Democrat curse?
I don't know. I never went and found out.
Because usually I've heard that's the evil Republicans, and now you're talking about witchcraft at Democratic club meetings. I don't know. It's interesting to me. And so, Marilyn, when did you first start getting engaged politically?
Way back in 1964, I boycotted Woolworths because their lunch counters were segregated, not in San Diego, but in other places. So we stopped going to Woolworths, and that was sort of an eye-opener. And in college, I'll say this out loud, I got involved with the Peace and Freedom Party. I did my college senior paper on the analysis of the coalition between the Black Panther Party and the Peace and Freedom Party, and met gun runners from the Panthers, and really tried to learn the political philosophy of why this group developed and what the Peace and Freedom Party was all about. Not that I voted for them, but I've always wanted to learn about everything, and I think that's one of the differences of having values versus being tied to a party, because I don't like being tied to a platform and having someone label me. As you can see, I'm not big into labels and being grouped, and I just find that that's not me. And so just bit by bit, little things, fighting for little things. In medical school, the women could only use the gym on Thursday nights. And it sounds odd today, and we thought, how are we going to be available only on a Thursday night? And starting to do little things to get your rights and push for it just because it was the right thing to do. Not because you were black, not because you were white, but some things are the right thing to do.
So political activism to you is combat.
To a certain degree.
Well, I resemble that remark. I don't like being put into buckets either, and so I've maintained my independence as well. And when you see something wrong, you want to go after it and get it fixed. But you're not just getting it fixed for one community. You're just seeing it as a rights issue for everyone, and you want to get involved. And so that's great to say. And just for clarification purposes, although you both consider yourself Republican, you're a registered Republican?
Yes, I am.
And you're registered?
Now declined to state, now called no party preference.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Because there is a distinction, as we've kind of alluded to, between conservatism and republicanism. Not all Republicans are conservative,
that's correct,
as we all know, and not all Democrats are actually liberal. Many of them are conservative as well. So we're on the topic of politics. How could we let it go by with our historic president being brought into the mix a little bit? And there was a lot of talk when Obama was elected about how, because he was a historic president and because he was going to be the first black president, that he would secure all black votes and he should still have all of them going through. But how do you feel about the policies that Obama is putting into place? And especially, it sounds like faith is a component for both of you, things that could be considered religious attacks that have happened even over the last week or two.
I think this is probably one of the most anti-religious presidents we've had. I think he has attacked our foundation in this country, America, Judeo-Christian beliefs. I think with the beginning with the National Day of Prayer and his behavior and conduct in regard to that, previously we had always had presidents who reverenced that. I mean, historically going back, we had presidents that called for national days of fasting and mourning. And recently, with his attack on religious freedom, basically now becoming a First Amendment issue. We have the right in this country, because of the Constitution, to express our religious views and not, through the tyranny of government, be forced into enslavement, to obedience to their perspective, their values, or their principles.
Okay. And Marilyn, are you in agreement with Obama's policies and the way he's run the country in general, or do you oppose?
No, I think the rise of the administrative state will be his legacy. I have found that bill after bill that's been put forth through the Congress and then passed in law during the Democratic majority have been very light on detail. So the executive branch has provided all the detail, as we've discovered with the new health care law, that very little detail given in the bill. And so the executive branch has basically been defining the laws. And according to the Constitution, Congress is who is supposed to be writing the laws, not the president. And Obama is just really relishing in this role as the chief executive, chief lawmaker, and if he gets any more Supreme Court appointees, he'll be the chief judge. And certainly Eric Holder is his proxy for being the chief judge, looking at the cases that Eric Holder has chosen to prosecute and others that he's chosen to let go by. One thing that just appalled me was North Carolina, who's still under federal voting rights review, wasn't allowed to have a nonpartisan election in one small town, even though everyone in the town voted for it. But they said, unless you had the Democratic queue on the ballot, black people wouldn't know who to vote for. This is sick.
And I think that kind of touches on the history of black voting, where we had congressmen who have said in the 1800s that the bad blood in the South is primarily because blacks refused to vote the straight Democrat ticket. And if we would simply stop voting Republican, then this bad blood would sink out of sight.
And so, well, first of all, I need to clarify that you're both racist because you disagree with Obama, number one. But number two, going back to what you
a
said.
badge I wear proudly.
Racists, a lot of you. No, so, but it is, you bring up an interesting historical perspective that in past times, pre-1964 times, the predominant black vote, as it were, wasn't Democrat.
Absolutely
it was
not.
Republican. And in fact, Martin Luther King, whose birthday is being celebrated, he was a Republican as well. And people don't know that. And so talk to me about why the shift happened. And because it was in the Republican camp, I guess we can let you cover that.
Well,
Rochelle.
historically, black people were Republicans, and the Republicans were the ones who rallied the flag, who first passed the first civil rights bill. They passed the 15th Amendment, the 14th, and the 13th, and basically that gave freedom from slavery. It gave us citizenship and the right to vote. What happened was when Roosevelt came in with the New Deal, pretty much at that point, he had a black cabinet. He started having his ear in the black community. And at the time, blacks were very informed on voting. They watched the voting records, and they found out who was an ally and who was a foe. And so that began to make a shift. It was very hard for blacks to leave the Republican Party, but because of the strategy of the Republicans to begin trying to recapture the South, and they began to disenfranchise some of the black voters, and that began to turn the tide.
Okay, great. And so now that we've moved to a point where the Democrats do tend to control the black vote to the degree that they do, I've found that wherever there's a highly liberal bias in the voting, that actually the people who are hurt most are the minorities and the poor people. You are both residents of Oakland or the Oakland area, and you're both, I don't want to say ruled by, but represented by Barbara Lee. Talk to me about the liberal policies and what you're seeing in Oakland, and from a very liberal mayor, Mayor Kwan, and if they are actually, these are what people are supposed to vote for in the poor communities. Is it doing them a service there, or is it that trend of worse treatment or worse poverty, worse education, where liberal policies reign?
In Oakland, particularly, our high school graduation rate is only about 60% in the black community, and that has gone down. Now, to their credit, over this last year, it's ticked up about 1%, but Barbara Lee, for example, doesn't support charter schools. Oakland, fortunately, isn't run by the federal government in that regard. And our charter schools have really helped these kids a lot. And that's what they need, is a good education in order to get a good job. And if they get a good education, they'll become more socially responsible, and our city will do better because we'll have more tax revenues. And there's a certain victim attitude that's put out there, and I think that it should offend people that they are thought of as inferior, that they need this extra help, rather than thinking about them on the same footing as everyone else. And both our mayor and our congressperson have really anti-family ideas. The idea that, for example, Lee voted against removing the marriage penalty from the income tax. So here it is encouraging people not to get married. And that will only get worse if they raise the taxes. And I'll tell you what showed me the embodiment of this sense that blacks are inferior in the minds of some of the liberal ruling elite is incurring favor with Cuba. Lee had a little arrangement, and Cuba offered to take American students in their medical school. And so she offered out, well, if you don't get in medical school in the United States, you can always go to Cuba. Well,
she is a Fidel fan.
Cuba has a 71% failure rate of the medical board. So you can go to medical school there, and then you can never practice medicine in this country. And I just felt that's what you think of your people,
right,
that you're telling them to go someplace where you'll likely never practice medicine. And why don't you study hard,
yeah,
and go to UCSF? Yeah.
And so, Rochelle, we have about a minute and a half left. Anything to add about liberal policies that we might want to look at changing to actually lift all people up as opposed to keep some of them down?
I think if the voters primarily start to look at tracker records and see how these policies are actually impacting their communities, I think if they educate themselves, become more informed, I think that it will improve our communities.
Okay, great. Well, we are wrapping up for now. I appreciate both of you very much for taking the time to come down and educate us all about what's happening in the global community as opposed to just the black community, but also sharing your knowledge and your passion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back in a moment with our next guest, Howard Myers. Welcome back, and we're now joined by Howard Myers, who is the president of the Conservative Forum, which is an underwriter of the show. Howard, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So for new viewers, tell us a little bit about the Conservative Forum, what you're all about, and who's coming up in the next meeting.
Thank you. The Conservative Forum is a group of almost 600 paid members that get together once a month. We have speakers. We get together, listen to the speakers, and promote the principles of American liberty through education. So our primary purpose is to educate people in conservative principles. We have some very impressive speakers. Next month we have Mark Meckler, the co-founder of the Tea Party Patriots. We have Brian Sussman after that, and in May we have David Horowitz. So we have a lot of good speakers coming up. We have a lot of people interested. We had a Hillsdale event last month with over 300 people attending, and we're getting more and more popular. We're growing. We started 8 years ago with like 20 people. And so we've never had a downsizing in membership. It's always increased every month, actually every year. And obviously one of our best recruiters is in the White House.
And that's, of course, sarcasm.
It is. Well, he is responsible for a lot of our memberships because people are seeing what's happening in this country and they need to do something about it. And what can they do? We have grassroots organizations that come and have tables set up. If you want to get involved, they tell you how you can get involved, who you can get involved with, and what they mean.
Okay, great. Now tell us how we can find out more about the Conservative Forum.
The Conservative Forum, we have a website. We have a new brochure. We just a piece of artwork. And we're on the website at www.theconservativeforum.com. And we meet once a month, first Tuesday of the month, except in July. We celebrate the 4th, so it's the second Tuesday of the month. And we meet, doors open at 6:45 p.m. Program starts at 7 o'clock sharp.
Okay.
It's the second Tuesday of the month at 432 Sterling Road in Mountain View.
Great. Well, we appreciate your sponsorship and your help. Now, as we close out the show, we're going to represent the testosterone component of the black community that also disagrees, as our previous guests, Rochelle and Marilyn, disagree with Obama's policies. I'd like to show you a quick video of Congressman Allen West.
This is a battlefield that we must stand upon. And we need to let President Obama, Harry Reid, Nancy Pelosi, and my dear friend, the chairman of the Democrat National Committee, we need to let them know that Florida ain't on the table. Take your message of equality of achievement, take your message of economic dependency, take your message of enslaving the entrepreneurial will and spirit of the American people somewhere else. You can take it to Europe, you can take it to the bottom of the sea, you can take it to the North Pole, but get the hell out of the United States of America.
And that was Allen West. I played the video for two reasons. Number one, it's not just Black History Month, it's Valentine's Day, and I have to admit, I've got a political man crush on Mr. Allen West. But on that note, have yourself a great rest of the week, and you've been joining us on The Right Side. Please come again and see us soon. Thanks.